Welcome to the Underwater Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the world of underwater portrait photography, cinematography, and everything in between. With me, your host, Brett Stanley. Welcome back to the Underwater Podcast. And this week we're heading to Bollywood with underwater cinematographer Priya Seth. Priya has shot underwater scenes for over 100 Indian films, and whilst she shoots on land too, it's the water that is her most favourite. We chat about how she got her career started, what it's like being a woman on set in such a male-dominated industry, and how she deals with all the different aspects of Indian cinema. Now, I have to admit that I didn't really know much about the Indian film industry going into this interview, so Priya schooled me quite a bit, including that the name Bollywood isn't really used within India to describe their version of Hollywood. It's more of a nickname, so enjoy my embarrassment at that. Alrighty, let's dive in. Priya, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm in Mumbai. It's 10:15 at night, and I think it's morning for you, so we're about 12 hours apart.
Yeah, and my day's just started. I'm trying to wake up.
Yes.
How is life over there at the moment? Have you been caught up in the whole COVID-19 thing?
Yeah, we're in the midst of it in India right now, and in Mumbai, where I stay, even more so. I think it's right now picking up numbers. You know, the city's kind of opened up, the country's opening up because we were on lockdown for very long, if anyone's been following this. So while the country needed to economically open up, this is when we're actually peaking. So it's a bit tricky at the moment. The film industry is still on lockdown completely. There's nothing that's begun. You know, there's still a little bit of small stuff that people are attempting. The government hasn't really given permission yet or the go-ahead to start filming. So we're in kind of this limbo space.
Yeah. Has the industry kind of worked out some requirements for opening up? Like, is there some way that they've worked out to be able to open up safely?
So they have sort of described this whole protocol the government has with the industry, but it just seems a little unworkable at the moment in its current form. So I think that's where there's been a stalemate, where they're trying to work out something that's sustainable, just cost-wise and just execution-wise, and what is practical. So we're still trying to work it out. We're not done yet.
I mean, it must be very hard. I mean, you work in Bollywood, which for anyone who knows is the Indian Hollywood, basically. Is that right? I mean, I don't know a lot about Bollywood. I know from seeing films and things on planes when I've been to India. But explain Bollywood. Tell me what it is from the inside.
Well, the Indian film industry, as we like to call it when we work within it and not Bollywood.
Right. Okay.
Is I work out of Mumbai, Bombay, which is where the Hindi film industry, which is kind of there are two large industries in India. One is Bollywood, which is what's known outside, and then there's one down in the south. So it's actually, India is quite prolific, and each region has a very, very strong regional film industry, which makes films in their own language. I work in the Hindi film industry based out of Bombay. I'm a cinematographer. I shoot movies, and I shoot a lot of underwater cinematography, which is why we're speaking.
Yeah. And so just to go back to that point, so is Bollywood not a term that's used in the country? Is it something that...
It is. It is used. It is used by a lot of people. It's just, when you work in something and that's my job and that's my profession, Bollywood just sounds like a bastardization of something and an imitation. So the Indian film industry is what one likes to call it.
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, it's that sort of stuff that I have no idea about. And being outside of a country, you kind of go with whatever you hear in the media. And to know that Bollywood is probably not the term you would like to be used, then that's good to know. So how did you get into the Indian film industry? What was your path into the industry?
So I've been working about, I think, 22 years. And I started working in the Indian film industry when I was about 19. I did a course in filmmaking at NYU, New York.
Okay.
And then I came back to India. And it was interesting because when I was leaving to come back, and I decided I wanted to do cinematography because that's not what I studied. I just studied filmmaking.
Right.
So the professor out there, actually, he was like, I know you're going to go back to India, and don't get me wrong, this was 1997. And he said, it might be a difficult journey for you because I don't know how many women cinematographers in India, because there are barely any in the US at the moment. And of course, go ahead and do what you're going to do. But I want you to keep this at the back of your mind. It may not be just a plain old ride like it would be in any other field of filmmaking. And
Right.
I brushed him off my shoulder completely and arrogantly because, you're young and you think you
Yeah.
can get anything in the world. And I think it was about 10 years later, I was like, wait, didn't he warn me of this? Someone told me this is going to be hard.
And was it as hard as you thought, or as hard as he warned?
I think one doesn't realize that until in hindsight, I think it was a very different journey than maybe a male would have had at the same time.
Right.
But when you're in the thick of it and you're in the fight, you're just looking out for the next day and the work you're doing. You don't really consider what your gender is or what you're just working. And I
Yeah.
think when you get
Yeah.
older and you can look at it from a little bit of distance and you're like, oh, wait, I think there was a difference there and there was maybe I didn't get the same opportunities as a woman. But at that moment, honestly, I didn't think of it even once.
Do you think that it was something that was, regardless of how hard it was going to be, it was something that you were going to achieve anyway because you're driven? You're that type of person?
Yes, I think I didn't even think about my gender ever coming in the way of what I wanted to do. And that's because of the way I
Yeah.
was brought up and the kind of school I went to. So interestingly, I went to all girls boarding school in India, and it's quite like the British system of boarding schools. So it was like a public school. And because it's an all girls school, I think contrary to what people think, you actually do disregard your gender because there's no boys to be pegged up against or compared to. Or there's no
Yeah.
activities in school that, it's like the girls will do needlework and the boys do carpentry. There's none of that. You're doing everything.
Which I guess is kind of a good thing.
Absolutely. It's only a good thing. So I came out without any idea that my gender was ever going to be a limiting factor. It was, in fact, always a positive and a plus because that's just the
Right.
kind of place I'd been in and the family I'd come from. So honestly, when I started working, I didn't care. I didn't care that, somebody had said this or someone had said it to me 100 times. It still wouldn't have stopped me. And
No.
maybe if I had failed later on, that was something I would have looked back at. But it wasn't going to stop me at all to go where I wanted to go.
And what was your family like? I mean, you did you have a big family? Or do you have brothers and sisters, or was it just you?
I have two brothers and a sister, and they're all older than I am. And I'm the youngest, which also is a good thing, I think, because you just always get your way. So I always,
Yeah. I'm the youngest as well, so yeah, I kind of get it.
exactly, right? So, I mean, no matter what, I'm going to get my way however I get it. And I think also growing up, considering, growing up in India and my family really had no film exposure at all. My father was a businessman and my mother was a homemaker and she came from a business family as well. So I think when I said cinematography, it first took a few days for them to pronounce it because it was like cinema, what? You
Yeah.
know? But when they knew that I really wanted to do it, there was absolutely nothing to stop me from doing it. And, at that point, it was different in India. Late nights, you're having to travel late at night, public transport, is it safe? You're working with 200 people on any film set. They didn't know anything, but I was very, very fortunate to work with a DP in India, in Bombay, who was he actually, in my formative years, is probably the reason I actually could stick around in a completely male dominated industry where the point I started, there was one other woman in the whole industry who was working.
Right.
So it was the kind of person I was working with as well.
Was that DP male or female?
Male. There were no female DPs.
Right.
There were none. There was just another female assistant. And the only reason I went to him was because someone said, oh, he has a woman assistant. And so maybe he'll be open to hiring another woman. So go talk to him. That was it.
Yeah.
There was nobody else in the
Okay.
country.
And he was totally open to it? Like was there any hesitation there, or did you have to
Not
prove
at
yourself?
all. Not at all, actually. He was incredible. I mean, I had to prove myself as much as anybody else would have to prove my craft
Yeah.
and, being a good assistant. But I never for 1 second from him felt that he was either patronizing me because of my gender or making me work extra hard because it was none of that. I was just the same. I was treated exactly the same, which was
Right.
great.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So were films part of your growing up? Was that something that you were kind of getting into as you grew up and that's why you wanted to become a cinematographer, or was it something you kind of found later in life?
No, it wasn't part of my growing up life that much at all. In fact, because I went to a boarding school, so we barely had television there. Like we had, I think, 15 minutes
right.
of television once a week. So,
Yeah.
and on Sunday we got to watch some crappy Hindi film, but there wasn't really that much exposure to films, and it wasn't something that I grew up with. But I did chance upon this a lot later in life, which was, 17, 18. I started
Yeah.
working summer jobs in Bombay at a film production house. And that was just accident. And that's when
Oh,
I
okay.
actually discovered that this is what I found it extremely fascinating. And I think what it did is just combine every possible interest and skill that I had. And I think if you're like a jack of all trades and master of none, filmmaking is a great place
Yeah,
because you get
true.
to do everything.
Yeah. Yeah, depending on the budget, I think you're either doing everything or, just that
Yeah.
one thing if it's yeah,
But you can
kind
have
of
so
just the
many
one.
interests because every film, I think, is an amalgamation of, whether it's music, art, technology, science, history. You're learning so many things. So I think if you have a curious mind, it's a really interesting place to be at.
Absolutely. And so how did you get into the underwater side of things? Was water a big thing for you growing up?
Well, yeah, I did swim a lot, and the water was something that was exciting. But that's not why this happened. I was already working in the industry, and there is this kind of the godfather of Indian advertising, this gentleman called Prahlad Kakkar, and he runs a diving school in the Lakshadweep Islands, which is off India. They're part of India. They're these gorgeous islands, and he had started a diving school there like many years before that, and people would go there and train. I had never been or even thought about it. It was something that was just not on my radar. I was only 18 at that point anyway, so it was not that,
Okay.
one had traveled a lot, 18 or
Yeah.
19. And I bumped into him somewhere, and I knew him because he was, I'd worked with him. And he looked at me and he said, equipment's going to be coming into the country, underwater cinematography equipment. And it's all young people like you who need to take the initiative and do stuff because who else is going to do it? Otherwise, it's going to
Oh,
show up and
right.
no one's going to know what to do with it. And
Oh,
I was like,
wow.
yeah, I was like, oh, okay, let's see. And yeah, my husband at the time he's a cinematographer as well. So I asked him, I was like, you want to go diving? And he was sure. So I was like, okay, let's go. And we went diving and we got ourselves certified. And a month later, this equipment arrived and there was the first underwater shoot on this ARI 3 housing Hydroflex, which had arrived from the US. And we had to go back to the islands, which was a month before the monsoon, so which is sometime around now. And the monsoons, the sea it's formidable. So we had to go out into the sea, 11 dives old, never held a camera in our lives, and go
Right.
shoot an underwater sequence for a film.
Oh, just like that.
And just like that, and buoyancy was all over the place. I was upside down half the time, the camera was somewhere else.
Yeah.
So finally our instructor, we balanced this camera on his head and he was like our tripod, so he
Oh,
would
right.
turn it and move it. We knew nothing.
Right.
And but that was it. And I think there was no looking back because it was something that was just so incredibly exciting to take cinematography. And again, I think the underwater part also is because I'm very athletic. I did a lot of sports. I played, and I think just to be able to combine the two and do something that crazy was just such a incredible accident. And I'm so glad I found it.
That's amazing that it was there not much underwater cinematography in India before that?
So before that, we didn't have any housing that was based here. So there was stuff that would come in from Singapore for a particular job. But then it was like
Right.
if it could afford it, then they would fly it down. Or we had something that was called the coffin, which was basically this box. It was like with these rivets, and it was like a box made out of wood and
Oh,
acrylic. Yeah,
right.
wood, exactly counterintuitive, which
Wow.
would have to be sunk with weights. And all you
Yeah.
could do was put on the camera. So there was a cable that was running out where you could just plug in the battery and you could
Yeah.
point it in the direction and hope you got the shot. And that was it. And I had worked on a
Wow.
job once with that, and I had no desire to be an underwater cinematographer looking at that.
Oh god, no,
So
that sounds horrible.
yeah, so there were very few jobs because we didn't really have any equipment. And as
Right.
yeah, so once it came in, of course, the minute it's based in the country and people start seeing more of it, it also has to be written into stuff, and then people started writing it into the scripts. And slowly, the more they saw and the more they got exposed to, the more jobs we did, people started writing more and more.
Right. And the sort of things that you start working on, did you start in the commercial world or were you in features to start with?
For the underwater stuff, both actually, because there were a few of us doing it, and I don't know how I ended up doing most of the jobs from back then and until now. So it was whoever needed it. And I think in the beginning it was commercials because people were happy to experiment with like a few shots underwater, or just one or two, kind of simple, for a soap commercial, or things like that, or some beauty stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then as because it always takes a while for someone to write it into a script, because it's not just cosmetic, it has to come into a story. So I think that took a little while for people to write it in. And then so does both actually, because And now I end up doing actually all the underwater work. It's not just the in Bombay, it's all over the country. So all the pretty much 90% of the underwater work that happens in India, I end up shooting all over for all the
Right.
films.
And how quickly did that happen for you? Like, was it a period of years for you to kind of make a name as the underwater person, or was it pretty quick?
No, it took a while, I think, because also underwater is such a niche job, and that's not the only thing that
Yeah.
I shot. I shoot commercials and films and things like that. So it's as many jobs as that are available, and sometimes there'll be, maybe one every 2 months. Sometimes you could be shooting two a month. It just depends. But I think it did take a while, but somehow, I think I did gain some notice for doing underwater work early on. And also, I think it's like being an animal in a zoo. I was a woman who was shooting underwater in
Right. Yeah.
India. So I think there was this novelty factor as well, which kind of gets you noticed a bit early on.
Yeah, I guess, whether for, for good or for bad, it would make you stand out if you're the
Exactly,
woman, the underwater woman. Yeah.
underwater woman. Exactly.
Yeah. Do you prefer the advertising over the features, or are they just sort of play with each other?
Oh gosh, no. I prefer features over advertising any day when I'm shooting
Oh, right.
underwater because for features, we get to actually. So, what ends up happening is that we get called in early on for a feature underwater job, and it's normally narrative storytelling, right? Because it's not just a couple
Yeah.
of shots like in advertising. So, and most often they're action sequences. So from anything like a car being like crashing into the water and people, something like that, or various things. So it's far more interesting because you actually have to craft a piece of narrative work which fits seamlessly into someone else's vision of of the film that they're making and
Right.
still tell the story correctly. So for me, that's very exciting because since I also shoot films, I am a cinematographer. To be able to collaborate with another cinematographer is not something you get to do normally. So it's very
Mm.
exciting. You get to, you have a collective vision of something. And I always ask for the footage of what they've shot before and after because there's no conceit in this job when I'm doing underwater work. It has to fit in with what the story is trying to do. If it shines out and just stands apart, then I would have completely failed as a cinematographer and as a skill that I should be having of also blending in and being invisible in the storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you work a lot with other DPs? Do you often do an entire production as the cinematographer yourself, or are you mostly being slotted in as the underwater person?
No, I shoot a lot by myself as well. I do. I shot an action film a couple of years ago. I shot, so I shoot movies and I shoot. So I shoot a lot. That's what I primarily do is I shoot by myself. It's only on underwater work that I get to collaborate, and which is also, maybe 12 jobs a year. It's not that much,
Right.
but because they're
Yeah.
so intense and it takes 4 to 5 days, it ends up being a lot of work. And even in those, probably 50-50 collaborative because a lot of the jobs the DPs don't, they don't need to be there because they know that there's another DP on the job. So, we discuss it and, I get the vision and I execute it. But on certain jobs, and like I would like to be on a set if someone else was shooting my underwater work, a lot of DPs like to be there so that they can also just control their vision. So those are the
Yeah.
ones which are collaborative.
Right. So with what I know of the Indian film industry, and I'm going to say Bollywood because that's
Yeah,
kind of what
sure.
it is from the outside. For
Yeah.
me, Bollywood is a lot of big musical numbers. It's usually some sort of love story. There's some sort of action in there. Is that just what I'm seeing from the outside? Is there more to it from the inside? Are you doing more of a range of storylines than what I'm
Yeah, so I think what you're
is
describing is
typical?
what Bollywood used to be. That's absolutely accurate. But I think in the last 10 years or so, it's changed quite a lot. There's been a lot
Right.
more variety in the works, a lot varied storytelling. The song and dance has gone down quite a lot. A
Oh,
lot, in
okay.
fact. Yeah,
Yeah.
so we don't have too much of that. In fact, the film that I did didn't have any, and it's not necessary anymore. And I think a
Okay.
good part also of having so much international exposure for people watching stuff in India is they're not only looking for that anymore. Earlier it was you just watched your own stuff and you were tied in your own loop watching Bollywood stuff. People didn't understand, the language. It was so now we get all English films that are dubbed in various regional languages. So
Oh, okay.
everyone, down to the lowest common denominator, is exposed to international films. So they understand that they don't necessarily need a song and dance to have narrative storytelling. And
Yeah.
and also just the industry's grown, right? With exposure, it's grown, storytelling has changed, it's become far more contemporary. So that used to be Bollywood of the past, it isn't anymore.
Right. And do you have a preference for how it works? Do you prefer the sort of evolved Bollywood, or do you have a nostalgia for the old Bollywood?
I have no nostalgia for the old Bollywood.
Yeah.
I have no knowledge of it. I don't really understand it. It's not something I grew up watching or imbibing, or it's not my aesthetic really. So I
Right.
quite enjoy where it's going because it allows people like us to be a part of it firstly. And the old Bollywood would have no space for women, so I have no nostalgia for it.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. So, what are sort of the films you've been working on recently? What sort of shots have you been doing under the water? What sort of scenes have they been?
So it is interesting. In this last 6 months, actually, we've done, like these big underwater jobs for films. One was for this, it was an action film which was based during the time of, this was pre-Indian independence. So it was a battle in, I think, 1840s or something. So it was a
Oh,
period
okay.
film. It was about the first freedom fighter, so to speak, who fought against the British. We're still doing that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a film about that. And so what we had done was we had made this set of a submerged temple in the south. And the sequence was that the fighter is fighting with this Englishman who's obviously raped and pillaged and looted with his people. They've raped the village. And now the protagonist, chases him into the river. And there's a
Right.
submerged temple there. And he then has a fight with him underwater in the middle of these ruins, which is quite beautiful.
Oh,
And
wow.
then he hacks his head off. It
Oh,
was 1800s, and
yeah.
this was still, we have the flair for the dramatic still in India. Yeah, we don't forget that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he hacks his head off and the head flies out of the water. So that was the
Wow.
sequence.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about it was that we actually shot the whole sequence in a pool, and we had built the whole set on these cranes and suspended it into the swimming pool and
Right.
covered the background with, like, because the water was meant to be slightly murky river water. So we had put this kind of a canvassy background in the depth and created some layering with that. We'd put in a lot of weeds into the water. And there was a lot of, on the surface, we had a lot of water jets, which were creating sort of surface current. So even when we were looking up, like there was a sense of river flowing by with
Oh,
leaves and
wow.
things like that. Yeah, so it
Yeah.
was a really interesting sequence, and it took us, I think, 5 days to shoot. And the actor was a slightly older gentleman, and he's a huge superstar, but he wasn't comfortable getting very deep down in the water. So
Yeah.
he did have some rudimentary training. But what we did was the set was suspended. We would take it deep down where we wanted to do dupe shots, and which were wider, where we would actually see like super wides with the surface. And then when we needed to shoot with him, we would lift the set and suspend it mid-water so we could shoot with him far shallower and cheat it there because he was very uncomfortable and slightly claustrophobic.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting way of doing it. So you actually got this set that is able to move to different depths depending on what you're wanting to shoot.
Yeah, we do that a lot actually, because in Bollywood, as you can imagine, we shoot with a lot of actors and actresses. And a lot of
Yeah.
them do the entire training program, but a lot can't, or are uncomfortable or hydrophobic, etc. So then what we do is we try and do it with, doubles, and we do all the wide stuff really deep down. And the whole set is suspended off an industrial crane. And then we
Yeah.
just keep moving it as and when we want, how much ever, the minimum possible requirement, so we don't stress the actors out, because it's also insurance and stuff like that. These are big actors and actresses. So to be
Yeah.
mindful of that. Yeah.
So, I mean, you must have some really classic actors there, like you say. Like the industry's been going for a long time. You might have some
Yeah.
actors who have been in the industry for their lives, like 40 years or 50 years, and
Yeah.
now they're doing an underwater scene. How do they approach it? Do you have people who are really like, yeah, this is amazing? Like, are they really getting into it?
So I think what has happened now, because of my colleague, he runs this company called Underwater Film Services. He's a diver with, I think, 30 years of experience. He's very, very highly regarded in India just as a dive instructor. And, he's kind of helped set up the diving scene here. So we work together, and he comes with such a high reputation that when actors even meet him once, you know that you're in very safe hands. And I think we've developed that reputation between us with the team that we have. So even if they are slightly wary of it and it is something that's very new, they just know that there is a system in place The
Right.
training is going to be very detailed. It's going to be done slowly. Anis, my colleague, even he has a storyboard with him. So what he does is he will then train the actors to achieve those specific shots as well. So that they do it very slowly and they take a lot of time over it so that they're very comfortable. Because as you can imagine, the worst enemy of, going underwater is panic. So we try to take that out of the picture entirely. And most people are on board because it's also exciting. It's a new skill for everyone. And unless you're terribly hydrophobic or claustrophobic, most people are up for the ride. I mean, actors and actresses like to do new things. So, I think
Yeah.
everyone's on board.
Yeah, and I think people like the challenge, and I think a lot of actors, it helps them do their character as well. If they can do these things and do their own stunts to a certain degree, I think it
Yes.
helps them be that character a bit more.
Absolutely. And I think what's ended up happening in a few of the recent jobs, I don't know if it's coincidental, that a lot of the climax of the films have been underwater. So then they do want
Oh,
to be a
right.
part of it, right? Because it is the culmination of the story. And then suddenly, if you see the whole thing with dupes, just as an actor yourself, I think you'll feel cheated out of it. So they're all willing to make the effort. They work really hard and train really hard. So it's been good, actually.
Oh, that's amazing. And what's your crew like? So you've got a niece who's doing a lot of the training, and I assume he's doing safety with you as well.
Yes. So he runs the safety team and the training. And he's comes from a film background actually, which is what makes it really good. So
Right.
so he does all of that part. Then I have an underwater focus puller. So we have the option of either pulling focus from the surface or from underwater, depending on how mobile I need to be and what I really, where I want my focus puller. Sometimes I like it better on the surface because if we're shooting in the day and exposure is varying a lot, it's much easier for him to judge it there and fix it there with the DIT. Because
Yeah.
on the underwater monitor, sometimes it's just, there's too much of reflection or stuff like that. But if it's something that I want my focus puller right there because the work is quite critical and precise, then, we pull from underwater. I have the option of doing both, which is great. And I have an underwater gaffer who works with me even above water. He's been working with me for about 7 years now. He works
Oh,
with me
great.
on everything. Yeah, and he went and got trained himself because he started working with me and loved the idea. So he went out, got trained, he's come back certified. He also shoots. Now he's a DP himself, so he shoots stuff himself. Otherwise, he
Yeah.
works with me. So I have my
Okay.
whole crew that I work with above water. They come underwater, which is great because it's just the understanding is 100%.
And that's the most important thing, I think, with the crew is having that trust and that understanding, and especially underwater, knowing what's about to happen or what needs to happen because you can't communicate apart from hand signals. So I guess you guys have got a little bit of intuitiveness to know
Absolutely,
what needs
absolutely.
to
You're
be
so right
done.
about that. Yeah. And just, yeah. So even with my focus pull underwater, I don't understand how he understands what I say because I don't even know what I'm trying to say half the time. I look at him
Right.
and he knows exactly what to do. And I'm like, how the hell did you figure that out? I didn't say
That's
anything.
right. And that's perfect. That's the best way to do it. I was
Yeah.
speaking to Pete Romano recently, who runs Hydroflex, as you
Of
know.
course, the legend.
Yeah. And so he's got amazing stories. But his thing is that his underwater grip or even focus puller at the time, he basically when he's finished shooting a shot, he basically throws the housing over his head and it just expects it to be caught.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do because I'm done with a shot and it's supposed like a long, complicated tracking shot. I know you've moved forward and the actor's like gone off. I just leave the housing and I know it's going to get caught. It's exactly that. And I think that's the
Yeah.
level of trust you need with your underwater crew.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's so much safety and trust as well, because you've got to have each other's backs if anything goes wrong. You've got to
Yeah.
be prepared, especially if you're pulling focus on the housing. You have to know what your operator is about to do so that you're not hindering them and
Yeah.
stopping them from doing the movements that they need to do, right?
Absolutely. And it boggles my mind to know how anyone pulls focus underwater. I don't understand it myself
Oh, yeah,
because,
neither.
yeah, because the actor's breathing and moving back and forth. I'm moving. And, when you're on land, you can see the adjustments because, if I'm handheld, you can still see me moving or leaning forward. Here, we're constantly heaving and rocking and the water is moving and then this guy pulls focus and again all these jobs are to be projected onto the big screen because that's what we're doing big cinema theatrical stuff and it's all
Yeah.
crack sharp and I just don't understand it. I don't get
No,
it.
it's insane. Are
Yeah.
you working with film anymore, or are you primarily digital?
No, it's all digital now. But I think if I were to hazard a guess, we were shooting film a lot later than anywhere else in the world underwater because we didn't get the housing until much later. because we're quite dependent on Pete's largesses and sending housings to India and letting
Yeah.
them remain here because we just have one.
Right.
So
What,
till the rental house in India could actually convince Pete to part with one of them, we were shooting on film. So we were shooting on 35 mil film for till very recently.
how recently? How long ago did the housing turn up?
I would say not more than 5 years ago, 4 years
Oh
ago.
wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Much after we were shooting digital on land, like we were shooting on Alexa and stuff like that. We were well into it. And then we started shooting. I may be wrong by a year or so, but it was very late.
And so
And
you were
yeah.
still shooting the film underwater at the up until that point because of the lack of a housing in lack of a
Yeah.
digital housing.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were shooting on the Ari, which is what the housing was, 400 mil
Right.
mags. It
Yeah.
sounds crazy. We were going out into the sea, into Maldives, and going like 20 feet deep into the water and shooting on 400-foot mags up to recently. I
I
can't
know
believe we
that's
actually
crazy.
did that. Yeah.
And so did you have you would have had a focus puller in the water then?
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, same focus
Yeah.
puller. So he would be in the
Yeah.
water, and the wheel was on the RE3. It was still attached to the housing, so he would pull from that. While now we have a remote housing underwater, so he can just be at least a little distant away from me.
That's interesting. Do you have a preference for film or digital?
I'm not going to ride that nostalgia boat, especially for underwater stuff. There is no comparison. Digital's better
Yeah.
because it's just too hard, especially when you're shooting long form work and every 4.5 minutes to get that housing out and change mags, and then you don't know what's happening, and just
Oh,
the
for
time that
sure.
it took. So it's far easier. Everyone can watch them. And you know what the thing with underwater work is, no one really knows apart from the crew who's doing it what it entails and what's going on. And every time you're shooting with someone, most often it is for the first time that they're doing something like underwater, like an underwater scene in a film. And the more uncertainty you take away from it and the clearer they are, the more comfortable they are and the more they're willing to experiment and actually push the form and the narrative form of storytelling shooting underwater. So with
Yeah.
digital, they can see the correct image up and they can judge it and you can light it and everything is clear. Everyone's more comfortable and it just makes for an easier work environment. With the Arri 3 video assist, no one really knew what was happening. So they're like, it's looking under to me. And I was like, no, trust me, I'm looking through the optical viewfinder. It's fine. And as it is, it's so uncertain. So there's no comparison for me.
There was an interesting thing with Pete when I spoke to him a few weeks ago, where he was going from the film to digital. The main thing he loved about digital was having a monitor. So with the film, you've got your eye pressed up against that eyepiece, and you're in that world, you're in that tunnel vision. But as soon as he kind of moved into having the monitor, he could then move the camera in ways that he couldn't before because it was attached to his head, basically. Is it
Yes.
the same for you? Do you find the same thing with the digital, that you can move that camera in more creative ways?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the other point, just to elaborate on what Pete said, is because it was an optical viewfinder and your eye had to be stuck to that, because if you didn't, light would leak in even from the front. And sometimes if you're not well balanced or something and you lost control of, where you were, and you've got this big fat mask that's sitting on your eye, you would get light leaking into the viewfinder from your side, which was just it's, it's such an avoidable thing, but it was such a shame.
And that would then affect the film.
Of course. It's
Wow,
like
I
looking through
hadn't even
any
thought about
optical
that.
viewfinder. Yeah. So that
Yeah,
was another issue. And you're always paranoid about that. So, of course, that's the reason he said you had to be stuck to it, because you couldn't even let it go and guesstimate the shot, because you would get a light leak. You could plug in the viewfinder, there was a little cap there. But, even just move it a little bit, you couldn't do that. So you had to constantly move your body. So it became quite rigid. And he's
wow,
absolutely right. So the kind of camera movements, because now you can swing the monitor anywhere you like.
yeah,
And of course, it's opened it up entirely.
that's incredible. And that was something that I hadn't thought about, was the light leaks coming in from the back. That's
Yeah.
a really good.
Oh, that was terrorizing.
I bet, yeah, because you'd be terrified that would happen and
Yeah.
ruin the shot. So now that you can move the camera in such more creative ways, are there some scenes that you've shot, like, that you're really proud of because of the creative use of the camera?
I think what happens now is, and I don't think it's a particular scene, but what ends up happening, the more you do this and the more, I think, it sounds a bit pretentious to say it, but the more one you become with the camera, because I think your diving skills and your operating skills just get so fine tuned
Yeah,
that you no longer have that separation between yourself and this huge, big, fat camera that you're actually holding, which is quite enormous. And, because we have the remote housing in India, which is really big. It's like almost like a big, I think it's 3 feet. So it's a
Oh,
really
yeah.
big piece of equipment. And it is aerodynamic or whatever, water dynamic, but it's big. But I think the more you develop your skill and hone your craft, for me now, I find no separation between myself and the camera, and I can actually move it with my body and I can move it exactly how I feel like without actually having to think so much about the camera movement. So it's made my camera movement a lot more fluid because I just feel like it's a part of my body now and it's an extension of my body, which is, I think, it takes a while to reach. And now that I've reached it, I just find that the most beautiful part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is something that comes over time. When you first get into underwater, you're so excited about being underwater and having this camera, and it's a very conscious decision every movement because you've got to control your
Yes,
body, you've got to control your buoyancy. Every breath can change the direction that you're going in. But once
yes.
you get more, as you say, like more simpatico with the housing and it becomes an extension of your body, you can really do things a lot more fluid because you're not
Yeah.
thinking about every little motion. It's you just want to, I want to be over there and I want the camera to move this way, and you just do it rather than thinking about the mechanics of how to do every step.
And it's interesting. And what people don't actually even realize is that it's not only about, moving just the camera. One is about how am I going to move the camera? The second thing is your breathing. You have to control your breath so much and so mindfully because every breath will affect the way the camera moves underwater.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
need to either not, like so many shots, you hold your breath for the entire duration of the shot. And a lot of the shots where you're, at the bottom of a pool or the bottom of wherever and tilted up, and it's your own bubbles that'll come in your own frame. So not only are you watching how you're operating the camera, you actually have to control your breathing, which is something that people just take for granted when you're shooting on land. You breathe and you do what you're doing. But for
Yeah,
us, we need
exactly.
to
Yeah.
control that so consciously.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even things like swimming backwards, like, if you're doing a shot where you've got to swim backwards and having your own fins
Yeah.
in the shot or seeing your own bubbles kind of slowly drift into frame, you have to work out the logistics of your own body and your own breathing.
Yes. And I think
And
that's where the experience comes in. After so many years, if someone's like, in the beginning, it'll be like a backward tracking shot. And you're like, okay, how the hell do I even figure this out? Because first you're figuring
yeah,
out the camera, then your own body, then you're right, the fins, your bubbles. How do you actually fin backwards without the camera going crazy? And I think, you work out these things over years and over experience. And by now, to get to that point where you can disregard camera movement, which is how, I like to see it. It just moves as I want to move.
it's a total extension of your body. It just
Yes.
does what you want it to. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Maldives. Are you going to a lot of awesome locations like that? Are you doing much open water stuff as opposed to tanks?
So in the beginning, there was a lot more open water stuff, which was so exciting. We would go to Malaysia, and we're located in such an interesting place in India that everything is just a couple of flights away or one flight away, all the
Yeah.
best diving places in the world. So we traveled a lot, and we would go to everywhere: Maldives, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mauritius, South Africa, shoot underwater everywhere. And for some
Wow.
reason, in the last few years, I find more and more tank work. And also, I end up recommending a lot more and more tank work because I think it's much more controlled and easier to execute in a tank. And I kind of describe it as akin to being inside a studio where you
Yeah.
can light it, control it. And once you're over the excitement of being in the open sea and, traveling and stuff like that, I think now it's about getting the job done to the best possible capacity. And in 9 out of 10 times, I found that a tank is better.
Right. Are you finding that special effects are playing a bigger role in that as well? Like you're shooting in a tank and then using like CGI afterwards to kind of make it a bit more like the open water?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And maybe that's one of the reasons you're right, is because there's so much, CGI has become so much better and cheaper. And also, when, for films, when you're shooting action sequences and things like that, to go out into the sea and shoot them is just impossible.
Oh,
So it
yeah.
does
Yeah.
make sense. You got a car crashing into the water, what are you going to do? You've got boats overturning, capsizing, things like that. So it just makes more sense. And with the kind of CGI we have now, it is so much simpler to light it over a 12-hour day where you haven't got shifting light, shoot it and give it to them and let them do the believability part of it.
Yeah. As long as you've captured the performance side of it, they can do everything else.
Yeah. And you light it well and you light it for whatever the end goal is. And I think one has enough skill to do that. it blends really well. So I don't think so. Yeah, I think that's a large part of the reason we're not going out in the open sea a lot. You're right.
Are there tanks in Mumbai that you use a lot? Do you have any indoor underwater stages, or is it all outdoor?
It's all outdoor. We have nothing in India. We work
Right.
with very little.
Okay.
We work with 2 underwater lights, and we work with 1 underwater housing and a swimming pool that we're lucky enough to have kind of modified and put extra filtration. It's outdoors
Yeah.
and it's outside the city, but it works beautifully for us because you can park big fat cranes on the side, saying we can suspend the sets if you want to put cars in, things like that, because that's a lot of the kind of work that I end up doing is a lot of action underwater.
Right.
So it allows for all of that, and we can rig up lights, things like that. So we've kind of now modified it more and more, and it works really well, but it's outdoors, but it's fine. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, you learn to work with what you have.
Exactly.
What projects do you have coming up? Have you got things in the works already, or is it because things are on hold? Is the future uncertain at this point, or do you have projects that are already kind of locked in?
Oh, I have a lot of projects that were locked in, and then, of course, we just froze everything. And going by what's happening at the moment in India, we don't really see any big long form work starting before October. So we might
Oh,
do a little
okay.
bit of advertising and things like that, but I don't see going into an underwater shoot or a feature film, what I was supposed to do before October. And also underwater
Right.
shoots, I'd be really worried about putting regulators and mouthpieces and, putting things in my mouth in the current scenario.
Exactly.
So, and water, and, it's just, so I don't, yeah, so all the underwater work is pushed as well. Let's see. Right now, we're thick in the middle of the whole pandemic in India. So it's going to be a while.
Priya, this has been amazing. It's really awesome to hear what's happening in India and your kind of story of kind of growing up there and getting into cinematography, and especially underwater. Thanks so much for sharing all this with me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Oh, good. And hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to go back and now that I'm done with cooking and cleaning for 9 weeks, I'm going to go back and listen to all the podcasts and actually see what you've been doing.
Well, I hope you enjoy them. Yeah.
I will. I'm sure I will.
Thanks, Priya.
All right. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And as always, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. If you'd like to connect with us or just learn more about my guests, you can hit our website at theunderwaterpodcast.com or on Instagram or Facebook. Also check out our regular live streams on YouTube. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to know more about my underwater photography workshops and mentoring, you can find me at brettstanley.com. The Underwater Podcast is presented and produced by me, Brett Stanley, and our music is Neo by Oh Boy. Keep creating, everyone. I'll see you in the water.